Hello and welcome to sim.bc, where it is right about 9:36 in the morning, mates. 9:36 in the morning. We're yet again up in the morning, and as you can see here, you can just skip to directly where the title thing begins, where the Smash begins, because today we are, yes indeed, actually going to talk about the Smash, if you want to skip to that to begin with. Just going to start by saying that we're going to go through some summaries before we start, right? Before we get actually into it from the previous videos. But before that, I'll just start by saying that you should totally watch Boogie2988's video about microtransactions and DLCs. Maybe not the first half is not that important regarding what we're discussing right here, but the second half, on the other hand, is actually taking up lots of good information when it comes to DLCs, when it comes to microtransactions, when it comes to gambling, when it comes to loot boxes, and addiction, actually, when it comes to, like, is people spending too much money on stuff? Are they not? Are they understanding the value of the dollar? Are they just viewing the in-game currency? Are they viewing the repercussions inside of the game or not? What is a DLC? What is counted as a DLC? When did it arrive? And of course, you should have some source criticism when viewing this video, as he will also state, but I will totally recommend you go over there and watch it if you're interested in what I've been talking about so far, because he's actually touching upon it in a very good and perhaps a bit more of a structured way than I have been. So without any further ado, mates, gonna start with going through a bit of a summary of what we've done so far. So we began this discussion with paying over playing, because that's what this is all about. Paying over playing at 136 with the serves. Just recap that. Free to play or buy to game can exist in both industries. What I mean with that is that either if you go into the freemium market or the buy to the game market, the idea of buying in order to skip a play can exist in both markets. In-game microtransaction needs to be a business model to gain income in order to get people to buy stuff. They can either make it exclusive to the in-game shop, or they can make it immensely hard to acquire it by just playing the game. And this is of course the industry and the developers saying that, well, we want you to actually spend money inside of the game. That's why we might make it extremely hard if it is a free-to-play model. And even in some games that you actually buy, we've seen this as well in Shadow of War, the latest Shadow of War game. In multiplayer, paying to sustain play due to servers need maintenance both in free-to-play and buying the game, because as we've seen and as we will recap as well, multiplayer games tend to need some sort of continuous revenue stream in order to keep their servers alive. When we go into 137, then, and the recap of that, we took up opportunity cost. An opportunity cost basically is how much of X you must give up for 1 unit of Y, and how many units of Y then respectively you have to give up in order to acquire 1 unit of X. This creates scarcity, and it is what rarity stems from. It is why you want an in-game currency. It's why you want, well, it's basically what rarity stems from. 1 unit for another is the base of how we weigh arguments and actions against one another, and it's how we weigh in-game currency versus real currency, so to say. Maybe you can't see real value in your money in your real life, which is kind of weird, but there are some people who are viewing that and having that problem. But once they translate it into in-game currency, all of a sudden they can buy stuff in the game, and that tends to have more of an impact. If we go into 138, we had 4 things that we recapped. We talked about whales, which Boogie2988 also is talking about. He's covering in a bit more sensible fashion, but whales supporting a microtransactions model in the microtransactions industry, because devs see a profit and they keep implementing them, keep implementing microtransactions. Whales are basically these people who spend a ludicrous amount of money on microtransactions, as we talked about in yesterday's video. Maybe a subscription base is better for multiplayer, but then you come into the console generations, let's say, the console aspect of the market and the industry, and you say that, well, they're already paying a subscription in order to access the internet on their consoles. If we put a subscription base on our games as well, that would create a problem, because we're actually exercising a penalty over them because they need to pay a double subscription, let's say. But the subscription base, in my opinion, is better if you have a multiplayer format, because that helps supporting the service and supporting new content. DLC or a new game. DLCs cost money to develop too, because yet again I'm referring to the article of yesterday when someone said I want the DLC, I want the additional content, but I don't want to pay for it. But as we all know, DLC costs to develop, costs money to develop. Otherwise, they will be part of the main game. Just serves as a way of enjoying the same game of a bit longer, because that's what DLC is. You're playing the same game but with new rules or with new content. If single player might act like an expansion pack or for a multiplayer game, that would be the same thing. Yet again, if we watch World of Warcraft, they had many expansion packs. One can say that that's just DLC because that's adding on to the additional game, but some people can actually argue that, well, after all these expansion packs, it's an entirely new game now than it was like 10 or 15 years ago. Free to play allows for new entries, which is ludicrously important because it lowers the barriers of entry, which is good for the consumer because you will have more alternative and it will be more accessible for you as the consumer. But then you need to back this free-to-play market in some way, and that tends to be microtransactions, tends to be viewing ads. Now that all of that is done, that only took like around 6 minutes to go through. We're going to start with today's video now that we've recapped, and it's 1:39 today, mates. And what are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about favoring paying over playing. Does it actually exist? Is it a thing? Or are we going to conclude that, well, it's actually not a thing? Well, to begin this discussion, I would like to talk about difficulty, because difficulty in games is what I think a lot of this steams from. Now, we have discussed that business models, sure, that is a thing, that free-to-play games need to have this, some sort of way of actually implementing a revenue stream. They need to have some way to actually gain money, because if they let you just buy the game for free, let's say free-to-play, they will not gain any money. But then so that's why microtransactions exist in a way. But then we also have the difficulty of games. Are games allowed to be difficult these days, or does it need to be some sort of way of you to be able to pay in order to skip it? Or should there be a skip button? And if so, how should you be able to skip? Is it a certain amount of in-game currency you need to gain in order to skip it, or should you be able to just pay in order to skip a level? This is what I think steams a lot of discussion as well, because some people are saying, well, games aren't allowed to be hard anymore. If you look at Super Mario Brothers, the original game, that was a lot harder than many of the games released today. And you have, if you do something wrong and if you make mistakes, you aren't actually penalized for them. So therefore, some people will actually argue that, well, I would like to have a bit of a what you would say, an alternative to actually pay to get over a certain obstacle, which some people say is ludicrous. I'm in that ballpark, and I think that is a ludicrous idea. But there are people that can already establish this idea of favoring one over the other, that thinks that difficulty in games shouldn't exist and you should be able to pay to get over that in order to enjoy the full game, even if that means you're paying more money for it because you're worse at the games, let's say. So favoring paying over playing, it does exist when it comes to difficulty, because many people tend to think that, well, I want to see the full game, but I don't want to actually pay for it. Which is kind of weird, yet again, in my opinion, but it does exist, so we need to acknowledge that that exists. But is that a majority of the market? I wouldn't believe so. Are people favoring paying over playing, or is it mainly cosmetics? Because for the longest time, it was additional DLC. With other words, you pay in order to play, to actually access the game to begin with, because you started off with games, you started off with these game cubes, right, that you started to play in arcades, and then you moved on to home consoles, and with home consoles came also DLC after a while. Started off in small DLC, maybe you bought a hat, or maybe you bought an additional in-game cosmetic item, maybe it was an armor for a horse, maybe it was a burger of a certain size or shape, something like that, something small. But it started the microtransactions and DLC, but that was actually just you paying in order to access more things in the game. It wasn't actually you paying in order to skip parts of the game, you just paid for more things to play. So one can argue that, well, actually paying for DLC isn't necessarily you pay to skip playing, it's actually you pay for supporting playing. Then it was cosmetics, Team Fortress 2 and Overwatch. That was the next thing, basically, right? It started with mini DLCs, and then you had microtransactions in the form of mainly cosmetics inside of games. Now we have, well, I would say, the problem of a power creeping in paid contents such as Battlefront 2 and Evolve. However, the community came down swift and fast on those games, so it tends not to happen anymore. But that was basically you were entering a game and you were paying in order to get an advantage over other players in a multiplayer setting. Now, could that be argued to be favoring paying over playing because you could access these things. At least I think you could access these things if you just play the game. But is it actually favoring paying over playing just because you paid for content that made you a lot stronger in the game, or is that just you saying that, well, I didn't enjoy playing the game until I had these things, so now I'm going to play the game for a lot longer than I would if I hadn't spent money on it? So is that just your view of DLC? That's also a kind of interesting discussion to have. Well, I've actually written this down, mate, so I'm just gonna read it off. In the end, it looks like there are some options of pay be better in a game, even though they are mainly shut down, whilst the more popular version is paying for cosmetics or additional content such as DLCs or expansion packs. Is this favoring paying over playing, or is it seen as a sort of support system for servers and paying in order to access additional content so that you can play more? I would argue that it is. And in the end there, to conclude this entire thing, all these parts that we've been discussing, to conclude, right, some people pay to get better. It's no, we can't get away from that. Some people pay because they don't want to get better. That's also one way of viewing it. They think that we're evening the playing field if we're actually paying so we get better because other people are more skilled, so we need to be better at the game baseline in order to compete with their skills. So they need to have a higher power in order to compete. Some people pay to skip content. That would arguably be that part. But generally, based on what we've been discussing here, people tend to pay in order to access or support their play. Nothing more, nothing less. They don't tend to pay the majority, right, of what we viewed. They don't tend to pay in order to skip content. They tend to pay in order to access content. So not favoring it, but doing it as a means to an end in order to play. Hence, favoring playing over paying. And just using paying as a support system of your play. And I tend to view that as a quite healthy way of playing and paying for a game. And if you think that, well, if you're starting to use multiple microtransactions, that can actually lead to a bad and unhealthy behavior, we have some videos about that as well, of gambling. But that was it, mates. That was the entire paying, playing, favoring one over the other discussion over a couple of videos. We've introduced some concepts that I hope are new to you, that I hope that you can utilize going forward in the discussion. Please join in the comments of what you think about playing over paying or paying over playing. What are you favoring? What do you think that most people are favoring? Was I way off the mark here with my estimates and my discussion? Was it too little of a discussion? Do you have some perspectives that you think that I missed? Please just join in the comments and criticize, because that's the way we all move forward together. Leave a like if you enjoyed this one and this little series of videos, and yeah, subscribe and all of that. But yeah, have a nice one, mates, and I'll see you, well, tomorrow actually, because we're doing a new thing. Probably it's a bit of a book review. Have a nice one, mates. See ya.